wireless problem, you say? Aha. Can we go back one, please? Okay, so that's me. I'm Ben Ward. As I said, I've got a couple of hats there. Mostly network architecture is what actually pays the bills. But it's all fed into building sensor networks and understanding wireless development. Has anyone heard of the Things Network? Okay, yeah, so brilliant. Things Network is very much of this ethos of community-run gateways and sensor networks for people to put their own sensors onto. It's a great way to get something launched like this, like Flood Network, to understand what will work and what won't without having to build an entire network. And believe me, you don't want to build or deploy a national network to find out something doesn't work. Next, please. Next slide, please. Which key do I use? Okay, sure. Thanks. So, as a child, this is where my talk sort of veers off from its normal path. I don't normally go straight to the end of the world, but as a kid, 1980s and into the 90s, I used to think what would happen if there was a major disaster. I still think this through now. Which things will work? What continues to work? What infrastructure is behind all this that allows us to live our normal everyday lives? So I think we're about 2 shopping trips away from oblivion at the moment. I think we've also all read about what could happen with Brexit and with the customs changes, with changes to the border, and how that affects supply chains. Incidentally, from my Jaguar Land Rover experience, I know there aren't actually any warehouses holding car parts. There are only what are called sequencing warehouses, where they bring all the parts in, rearrange them so that your leather seats appear on the production line as your diesel chassis comes through the production line. That's all they're there for. So there isn't actually any storage. So the storage is actually on the road right now. If you look at what you expect to work after, say, in the 80s, it was very much about nuclear war. The radio is about the only thing you could expect to work. It's the kind of bare minimum way of communicating. So thinking about how things fall apart is just as important as how to build things. And how wireless degrades in a busy room, for example, is one of those. Okay, imagine a picture of a flood with a bus driving through a flood. This is Oxford, and it's very much at the bottom of a hill instead of the top. This was an area which wasn't meant to flood. This is on Cowley Road. Anyone know Cowley Road in Oxford? There's always someone. It's at the end of a stream of a steep valley, and there's absolutely no flood monitoring in place there. And yet you'd have thought there might be something. That's what I discovered when I was living in Oxford. We live essentially in a floodplain. I was stupid enough to buy a house in a floodplain. I discovered you can't find out actually where the flood is without going out on your bike and having a look for it in the dark, looking for a flood on your bike. It's not a good idea. So I thought, well, why not I just put some of this sensor technology together to have a go. This is the current coverage, or I guess it was 2015 coverage from the Environment Agency. I don't think it's changed a lot. It looks like a lot, doesn't it? It's good coverage there. But when you get really close in, what you discover is well, it's only about 5 or 6 spots that are actually being measured there. And none of them are upstream from where that flood happened. So I thought, let's get some sensors in. Why don't they have any sensors? And the reason is that's what they used to put in. So this is a big riverbank, false riverbank. So immediately you can imagine how much that costs. Working above water, then you've got to go through all the regulations, the health and safety checks, the risk assessments, all the training. That would cost in the region of 20 grand to build that monitoring station, which tells you the level of the water. So we built this one for about 200 quid, 300, which essentially does the same thing. Maybe not to the standards that we thought the Environment Agency would expect, but actually surprisingly robust and capable. The wireless technology back then was a bit far behind, but that's one of the lessons: is don't build for what the technology is today. Just plan to meet the technology as it matures. Otherwise, you'll always be building something for the old technology. The first one looked like this. That's the prototype. Never put something like that under a bridge. It's my advice. It's it's all very well this maker mentality. We'll get something built, we'll lash it together. Do not make it look like a bomb and stick it under a bridge. So this was connected to someone's broadband in the house next to it. That's about as far as we could reach back then. That's the evolution of sensor technology. So this one on the left the sensor lasted 24 hours. That's why it's £8. The sensor on the right, still going. It takes a lot of understanding what you've got to do. IP55, didn't even know what IP ratings were. That is actually pretty important to maintenance. IP is ingress protection. It can protect you against dust, water, jets of water. It goes up to something like IP67 in this country, and that's because we don't have water cannon, or we didn't. In Germany, it goes up to IP6X, and they can spray it with high velocity jets. And that's what I wanted. I wanted this to be like measles, all of the sensors around Oxford to monitor. But I didn't know how to actually build it, and that's why I went down the startup route instead of trying to get a community together. Now, community building is not one of my strong points. Just faffing about with technology is. So that's the way I started. Had to try and think of a business model to go with this, to support it. As it was, I got funding from Nominet. Nominet of DNS, the DNS world, name registrations. So a bit of a strange direction, but it was a very good fund. And Bethnal Green Ventures, who also funded it, which they're funded by Nesta and so on. But things fall off, things fall apart. So these are sensors in Hebden Bridge. These drop off, they get wet. The first version of them had firmware bugs. The firmware would just hang and then eat the battery and it would stop. Sometimes wet trees stop wireless signals. So when it gets wet in the summer, then they work less effectively, sending the signals back. And also, people like hitting things with sticks. So things just disappear, and you don't know why. And this costs a lot. I'm not going to be hanging off a bridge trying to put a sensor up like this. So somebody has to pay for the expertise to be able to do this kind of thing. And either that comes out of your own pocket, or you find some other way of doing that. And rather you than me standing in a step ladder in Hebden Bridge in a river in the snow. So it's nice for sort of walking holidays with ladders. It's quite nice. So actually what's going on here? Well, there's more than just the sensors disappearing. Who recognises this? Okay, shout out the name. Little Printer, that's right, yeah. So Little Printer was one of the first connected products. It was quite a niche product. It didn't have a lot of purpose, but it would print a face. Waste a lot of paper in the process, but it would print a face and also, a daily poem or a joke or a love message from someone. And it's great. It was fantastic. It used a little thermal paper. It's a well-made little product. And then it stopped working because no one could support the infrastructure. There was no model for the infrastructure to be supported. And that's what you've actually inadvertently bought into, is a SaaS model, software as a service, but with a little physical manifestation at the end. So actually you've bought the entire infrastructure. But of course, being the cloud, it's just someone else's computer. So this is what happened when I just tinkered with one application. So I was down at about £2 a day, and I switched on this application, and suddenly I'm on £50. Before I could switch it off, it was going to go up and up and up and up. that is happening all the time. If you imagine that all the time for any application, the costs are just increasing, or they're continuing to rise cumulatively, and someone has to cover that. How do you do that? Computer time isn't free, and if you think about how others support this, so OpenStreetMap, Wikimedia Foundation, they've got a foundation that will organize that and will also take the funding and help to collect funding to continue to run that infrastructure. I wouldn't know where to start to build a foundation, but maybe we, as a whole, can actually use experience to make a cookie cutter, a template foundation that people can use to launch this kind of idea to sustain projects. Discourage disruption, I would like to state here. The fight back against disruption starts here. We don't need any more package managers. What we need is somebody to actually maintain things, to look after stuff, and to enhance as we go. Transient services break. If someone stops paying for it, the credit card expires. Even if your credit card expires, your entire cloud service can go down. I've looked at people who are looking for accounts that will outlive them, for example. It's almost impossible to find an account that you can guarantee will outlive you and your credit card. Here's an example of, there's quite a lot of backing, the W3C, but this is the schema. This is 20 years old, and this is at the top of HTML web pages. And this is a schema that defines how HTML should work, or something like that anyway. I don't want to know, actually, but it's. I was just astounded to see a URL that would have to live forever. This has to live forever, otherwise things will break. And in a very big way, the whole of the web browser world will have to stop using this URL. And finally, just do we really want to do this? Do we actually want to keep this going? You've got to think whether this is your hobby. Is this something that you're building for others? Who ultimately is going to look after it? It could outlive itself, outlive its usefulness, and become a burden, which in some ways it has for me. It's almost more of a hobby than an actual business now. I had someone phone me up saying, I'm taking the sensor to Malaysia next week, so can we get the SIM sorted for the pay-as-you-go SIM card on the gateway that's on a shop 2 hours from civilization? I think really have to go through remote support for someone standing on top of a building in Malaysia is not, over the phone, is not something you want to be doing and not get paid for. So, yeah, ultimately, someone's got to pay for some of this stuff to actually continue to happen. This was Flood Network's business model. I had great ideas. You see the community part is down there, the third-party networks. You've got the environment agency feeding the data, and then people actually buying the data. I could still build that, I guess, if anyone wants to help, but right now it's just more or less community flood network database and 1 or 2 customers. And just to summarize, slightly cultural appropriation here, I apologize for that, but just other people have thought about this. I think this is probably worth bearing in mind, that Vishnu, the maintainer, is the one that keeps things going. There are lots, it's all very exciting either end. Don't forget that when you're destroying something, often you have to take it somewhere, it has to go somewhere. It is really easy to destroy something digital. Just delete it, it's gone. It doesn't take up any space. It might even still live there and just be the head cut off it. We're all in the middle, I hope, today. And maybe if slightly less offensive is anyone watch Grange Hill in the 70s? They are Mr. Griffith, the caretaker. I would like to think of myself as Mr. Griffith, the kindly caretaker of the Internet of Things. Thanks.